They called it the race. But there was no starting ribbon, no applause, no finish line waiting in sunlight, only darkness and the promise of death. On a suffocating summer evening in the year 1856, deep in the pine-shadowed wilderness of East Texas, lanterns began to glow like restless spirits across the grounds of Blackwater Plantation. The air hung thick with humidity and the buzzing of insects. Cypress trees stood like silent witnesses along the edge of the swamp, their twisted roots reaching into black water that swallowed sound and light alike. Carriages arrived, one after another, wheels grinding through dust and mud. Well-dressed men stepped down from polished seats, their boots gleaming, their coats tailored from the finest cloth money could buy. They laughed loudly. They slapped each other on the back. They spoke in confident tones about cotton yields, land purchases, horse breeding, and about something far darker. They had not come here for business. They had come for sport. Servants hurried to take their bags. Bottles of imported whiskey were uncorked. Cigars were lit. Hunting rifles, engraved with silver and gold, were lifted from leather cases and examined with pride. Packs of lean, muscular dogs strained at their chains, jaws snapping at shadows as if they could already taste blood in the air. These were not poor farmers struggling to survive. These were the wealthy masters of the southern world, men who owned hundreds of acres and hundreds of human beings, men who believed the color of a man's skin determined the worth of his soul. As night approached, the plantation transformed into something unnatural, a festival built upon cruelty. Lanterns were hung from tree branches. Long tables were set with roasted meats and sweet pies. Music drifted faintly from the main house where laughter echoed through tall windows. Yet beyond the glow of celebration lay the swamp. 2 miles wide, 3 miles deep. A labyrinth of mud, water, quicksand, and hidden death. The local people avoided it even during daylight. They said the swamp swallowed men whole. They said spirits moved beneath its dark surface. They said if you stepped in the wrong place, the earth itself would drag you down and erase you as if you had never lived. To the hunters gathered that night, it was the perfect arena, because in this place, no witnesses would remain. No evidence would be found, and no mercy would exist. At exactly 9 o'clock, the entertainment would begin. 13 enslaved men would be released into the swamp with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the terror in their hearts. They would be given a head start, 15 precious minutes to run, to hide, to pray. Then the horns would sound. Then the dogs would be unleashed. Then the hunters would ride into the darkness with rifles raised and wagers placed. The rules were simple. Run or die. For 7 straight years, this ritual had been carried out under the cover of new moon nights. Wealthy men had traveled from as far as Charleston and New Orleans to take part. Gold coins had changed hands. Banknotes had been stacked high upon tables. Bets had been placed on how long a man might survive before being shot, drowned, or torn apart by hounds. 70 men had entered that swamp. 70 men had never returned. Some had been killed within minutes, their screams cut short by gunfire. Others had lasted hours, driven deeper into the black water until exhaustion dragged them under. A few had tried to fight back with bare hands and broken branches, acts of defiance that only amused the spectators. Their bodies had been left where they fell. The swamp took care of the rest. By dawn, the hunters would gather again on the plantation lawn. They would drink coffee and discuss the night's excitement. Servants would wash blood from boots and saddles. The dead would already be forgotten, their names never recorded, their stories never told. Life would continue as if nothing had happened. This was the world of Blackwater Plantation, a place where human suffering was not just accepted, but celebrated. Colonel James Whitmore, the master of the estate, stood at the center of it all. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always dressed in immaculate white linen, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had inherited the land, the house, and 147 enslaved people from his father. To him, they were assets, numbers on paper, tools to be used or discarded at will. Cotton and tobacco had made him wealthy, but cruelty had made him entertained. The race had begun as a drunken wager years earlier, a reckless challenge between Whitmore and neighboring planters about whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp. What started as a cruel joke soon became an annual spectacle. Invitations were whispered across state lines. Participation became a mark of status among the plantation elite. To be invited meant you were powerful. To win meant you were feared. As darkness deepened, the men gathered near the swamp's edge, their faces lit by flickering lanterns. Some spoke excitedly about last year's hunt. One boasted of shooting a fleeing man through the leg just to watch him crawl. Another laughed about a boy, barely 16, who had tried to hide underwater and drowned before the dogs could reach him. They told these stories the way others might recall a successful fishing trip. Behind them, in a fenced holding yard, 13 enslaved men waited. Their wrists had been unchained. Their ankles were free. This false kindness was deliberate. The hunters wanted them strong. They wanted them hopeful. A man who believed he might escape would run harder, fight longer, provide better sport. Some of the men stared silently at the ground. Others whispered prayers. A few trembled uncontrollably, knowing what the night would bring. But among them stood one who did not shake. He was tall and lean, his body marked by a network of scars that crisscrossed his back like lightning frozen in flesh. His eyes were steady, dark, and watchful. He moved little, spoke less, and revealed nothing of what stirred inside him. The other enslaved people had begun to call him by a single name: Abel. He had arrived at Blackwater only months before, sold cheaply because of his reputation. Twice he had attempted escape at another plantation. Twice he had been caught. Each time he had endured 100 lashes without begging for mercy. The overseers believed those punishments had broken him. They were wrong. Abel had learned something far more dangerous than obedience. He had learned patience. For weeks he had listened quietly, gathering knowledge like a man gathering weapons. He had studied the layout of the land, the habits of the hunters, the weaknesses hidden beneath their confidence. He had watched the other enslaved men and women, searching for those whose spirits had not yet been crushed. And he had found them. Now, as the lantern light flickered across the yard and the distant swamp breathed its slow, humid breath, Abel lifted his head and looked toward the darkness. Somewhere out there lay death. But somewhere out there also lay opportunity. Tonight, for the first time in 7 years, the rules of the hunt would change, because the hunters believed they were chasing prey. They did not yet realize they were walking into a trap. And before the sun rose over Blackwater Plantation, before the last echoes of gunfire faded into the swamp, The men who had come seeking entertainment would discover a truth they had never imagined possible. This year, the prey had a plan. Abel first heard about the race on his third day at Blackwater Plantation. The sun was already high, turning the cotton fields into a blinding sea of white. Heat shimmered above the earth. Sweat soaked through his thin shirt and ran down the deep scars on his back like rainwater down cracked stone. He worked in silence, his hands moving automatically through the cotton bolls, pulling and stuffing the fiber into a rough sack slung across his shoulder. Around him, dozens of enslaved men and women labored under the watchful eyes of mounted overseers who carried whips coiled like sleeping snakes. Abel kept his head low, but his ears were always open. 2 overseers stood near the edge of the field, smoking pipes and talking in the lazy, careless way of men who believed they were alone among animals. "You hear Whitmore's planning the hunt earlier this year?" one said with a chuckle. "Yeah," the other replied. "Got himself some fresh stock, too. A troublemaker from Louisiana, supposed to run like a deer. Might make the betting interesting." They laughed. They spoke about the hunt the way men might discuss horse racing. One told a story about the previous year, how a man had survived nearly 3 hours before the dogs tore open his legs. Another described how a boy had tried to hide underwater and drowned when fear forced him to breathe. They found it all terribly amusing. Abel said nothing, but something inside him grew very still. That evening, when the long day's labor finally ended, he sat quietly in the slave quarters, observing the people around him. The cabins were small, crowded, and poorly built. Gaps between the wooden planks allowed wind, rain, and cold to enter freely. 6 men slept on the dirt floor beside him, their bodies exhausted beyond speech. The meal was the same as always, coarse cornmeal and a strip of salted pork. Survival food. Nothing more. Abel ate slowly, his eyes moving from face to face. He studied the way people spoke to each other, the invisible hierarchies that existed even in bondage. He learned names. He learned histories. He learned who had hope left and who had none. There was Samuel, the plantation blacksmith, a giant of a man with thoughtful eyes and hands hardened by years of shaping iron. There was Moses, who cared for the horses and understood animals better than he understood people. There was Isaiah, older than most, whose quiet memory stretched back across 15 brutal years at Blackwater. And there was Ruth. She worked inside the main house. House slaves were treated differently. They wore cleaner clothes. They moved through rooms filled with luxury. But their chains were no lighter, only less visible. It was Ruth who came to him first. She appeared in the doorway of his cabin late one night, moving with a silence born of practice. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and only faint starlight filtered through the gaps in the walls. "You're planning something," she whispered. It was not a question. Abel sat up slowly, his muscles tensing. Informers were common on plantations. A single whispered accusation could mean torture or death. Ruth stepped closer. "I ain't here to betray you," she said. "I've seen the hunt 3 times. My brother was in it last year." Her voice did not tremble, but her eyes burned. "They set the dogs on him before he even reached the trees. I had to serve brandy to the men who bet on how long he'd last." Silence filled the cabin like thick smoke. Abel studied her face, searching for deception. He saw only pain and something else. Resolve. Slowly he nodded. That was how the conspiracy began. Over the following weeks, Abel moved carefully across the plantation. He never spoke to more than one person at a time. He never met in the same place twice. Conversations happened while drawing water from the well, while hammer blows rang in the blacksmith shop, while tobacco leaves rustled in the drying barn. Each meeting carried enormous risk. If even one person betrayed them, the punishment would be beyond imagination. But Ruth brought information no one else could obtain. She cleaned the colonel's study and read letters he left lying carelessly on his desk. She served drinks during evening gatherings and listened to men brag about their hunting skills. She watched where keys were kept, how weapons were stored, when guards became drunk enough to forget their duties. One night, she told Abel something that changed everything. "This year," she whispered, "they're going to leave you unchained before the hunt, all afternoon. They think it'll make you run harder if you have time to dream about escape." For the first time since arriving at Blackwater, Abel smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found his enemy's weakness. Samuel the blacksmith became essential to their plan. In stolen moments between legitimate work, he began shaping scraps of iron into crude blades. He worked slowly, hiding each piece beneath piles of coal or burying them in oilcloth to prevent rust. Moses studied the horses and the swamp itself. He knew which paths were firm and which were death traps. He mapped the terrain in his mind: fallen trees, deep pools, hidden ridges of solid ground where a man could stand unseen. That night, Abel gathered the men he trusted most. One by one, he told them the truth. They would not run. They would not hide. They would turn and fight. Some hesitated. Years of brutality had taught them that resistance meant suffering, that survival depended on obedience. But others listened with rising fire in their eyes. Thomas had lost his wife to a slave trader's wagon. Benjamin bore scars from holding burning coals as punishment. Elijah's young son had been beaten to death for stealing fruit from the orchard. Each carried grief like a permanent wound. Each understood they were already living half-lives. Hope began to spread like a quiet disease. Yet danger remained everywhere. A single careless word, a single frightened glance, a single overheard whisper, and everything would collapse. Then, one morning in early June, Colonel Whitmore gathered the enslaved men in the yard and began making his selections. He walked among them as if choosing livestock. He tested muscles. He checked teeth. He asked overseers which men could run the fastest. One by one, he called out 13 names: Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 5 others who knew nothing of the plan. Abel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Time was running out. Now the conspiracy had to expand or die. In just 2 weeks, either they would be free or they would all be dead. Darkness came slowly to Blackwater Plantation. The last streaks of sunset faded behind the tall pines, and a heavy silence settled over the land like a warning. Then, one by one, lanterns began to glow across the property, casting trembling circles of yellow light onto packed dirt and trampled grass. From the main house drifted the sounds of laughter, music, and clinking glasses. The hunters were celebrating. They had dressed for the occasion as if attending a grand social event. Fine coats, polished boots, gold pocket watches. Some wore wide-brimmed hats tilted with careless confidence. Others carried rifles slung casually across their shoulders, expensive weapons crafted with pride and precision. Servants moved among them with trays of whiskey and roasted meat. Cigars burned bright in the humid night air. Conversation flowed easily, Stories of past hunts, wagers placed months in advance, predictions shouted over the noise. $5 says the young one drops first. 10 says at least 2 make it past midnight. 50 says my dogs draw first blood. The betting table near the veranda overflowed with gold coins and folded banknotes. Lantern light gleamed off polished metal like small fires dancing in the dark. To the gathered men, this was entertainment. To the enslaved, waiting in the holding pen near the swamp, it was judgment night. 13 figures stood together behind a rough wooden fence. For the first time in their lives on that plantation, their wrists were not bound. Their ankles were free. Freedom, given only so it could be taken away. Some stared into the darkness of the swamp as if trying to memorize its shape. Others whispered prayers under their breath. One man shook so violently his teeth rattled like loose stones. Abel stood still. The air smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves, and stagnant water. Mosquitoes whined in endless clouds. Somewhere deep in the swamp, an unseen creature splashed heavily, reminding them all that danger did not belong only to the hunters. Time moved strangely. Minutes stretched like hours. Then Colonel Whitmore climbed onto his raised wooden platform. He lifted a pistol high into the lantern glow, his face flushed with drink and excitement. "Gentlemen," he called, his voice booming across the assembled crowd. "Welcome to another fine evening of sport." Cheers answered him. The dogs strained at their chains, muscles quivering with hunger. They had been kept half-starved for 2 days. Their ribs showed through taut skin. Foam gathered at the corners of their jaws. The colonel smiled. "At 9 o'clock sharp," he continued, "the prey will be released. You'll have 15 minutes to allow them a sporting chance." Laughter rolled through the gathering. "Then," he said, lowering his voice with dramatic pleasure, "the hunt begins." He fired the pistol into the sky. The sound cracked through the night like thunder. The gate of the holding pen swung open. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Abel stepped forward. The others followed. They did not run wildly as the hunters expected. They moved fast, but controlled, splashing into the black water at the swamp's edge, disappearing among the shadows of twisted cypress trunks. Behind them, the crowd roared with excitement. Some men raised glasses in mock salute. Others shouted encouragement to their favorite hounds. But inside the swamp, everything changed. The lantern light vanished within seconds. Darkness closed around the fleeing men like a living thing. Water rose to their knees, then their thighs. Mud sucked at their feet. Branches clawed at their faces. 200 yards, Abel whispered. Then we split. His voice was calm, steady. The group ran in silence, except for the sound of breathing and splashing water. They followed paths they had memorized over long weeks of preparation. Routes marked by fallen logs, lightning-scarred trees, patches of strange glowing moss that warned of hidden quicksand. Behind them, distant shouts echoed. 15 minutes. That was all the time they had. At exactly 9:15, a second gunshot shattered the night. Then came the sound that had haunted the dreams of enslaved people for 7 years. The dogs were released. Their howls rose like something demonic, rolling through the swamp in waves of terror. Soon after came the splashing of horses entering the water, men yelling orders to one another, rifles being cocked. The hunt had begun. Abel raised his hand. The group split into smaller units just as planned. Caleb and Simon followed him toward the eastern edge where Samuel had hidden iron blades wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas and Benjamin moved west toward sharpened wooden spears buried beneath leaves. Marcus and Elijah headed north into deeper water where horses could not follow. Each man vanished into darkness. Each carried the same terrifying choice: fight or die. Abel's group reached a lightning-struck cypress tree and found the hidden weapons exactly where Samuel had promised. Abel unwrapped one blade and felt its rough weight settle into his palm. It was crude, uneven, but sharp enough to kill. They crouched low in chest-deep water and waited. Time slowed again. Mosquitoes bit exposed skin. Frogs croaked. Somewhere close, a dog's bark grew louder. Then footsteps. A young hunter stumbled into view, lantern swinging wildly from his hand. He moved carelessly, convinced his prey was far ahead. He never saw Abel rise silently behind him. The blade slid between his ribs. A muffled gasp. A brief struggle. Then stillness. They pulled the body into the water. The swamp swallowed him without a sound. Chaos began to spread. Gunshots echoed in different directions. Dogs yelped in sudden pain. Men shouted in confusion. The hunters realized too late that something was terribly wrong. The prey was not running. The prey was fighting back. And deep in the darkness, the balance of terror had begun to shift. And then, the real battle began. The swamp had turned into a battlefield. Gunfire cracked through the darkness in violent bursts, echoing off water and trees like thunder trapped inside a cage. Lanterns swung wildly in frightened hands. Horses screamed and reared. Dogs howled in confusion and pain. For the first time in 7 years, the hunters were afraid. They had entered the swamp expecting a game. They had found a war. Abel moved through the black water like a shadow. Mud coated his legs. Blood, not all of it his own, stained his hands. Behind him, Caleb and Simon followed silently, their breathing heavy but controlled. They could hear shouting ahead. White men calling to one another, trying to regroup, trying to understand what had gone wrong. But there was no time for understanding. Only survival. Abel signaled the others to spread out. The plan was simple now. Strike fast, disappear, strike again, never allow the hunters to form a line of defense. They found their next target near a fallen tree where 2 men struggled to control a terrified horse. One of them fired blindly into the darkness, the flash of his rifle lighting his own face with fear. Simon rushed forward first. The heavy branch he carried crashed against the man's skull with a dull, final sound. Caleb tackled the second hunter into the water, wrestling for control of the rifle. The weapon fired once, the shot vanishing uselessly into the night. Then, silence. 2 more bodies disappeared beneath the surface. The swamp drank deeply. From somewhere to the west came the sound of dogs screaming, not with hunger now, but with terror. Thomas and Elijah had reached the hidden spears. They fought like men who had already accepted death. One dog fell with a sharpened stake through its chest. Another fled into the darkness, yelping wildly. The hunters began firing at anything that moved. Shadows, branches, even each other. Fear had spread like fire through dry grass, and fear was exactly what Abel had counted on. He gathered the surviving groups near a narrow clearing where the ground rose slightly above the water. Lantern light flickered through drifting mist. Faces appeared one by one. Marcus, Joseph, Moses, Simon, Caleb, Isaiah. Alive. But not all. Benjamin was missing. David had been shot through the shoulder but still stood, teeth clenched against pain. They had no time to mourn. "Back to the plantation," Abel whispered. "The swamp has done its part." They moved quickly now, following secret paths Moses had memorized. Behind them, scattered gunfire continued as hunters stumbled blindly through mud and darkness. By the time they reached the edge of the swamp, chaos had already spread across Blackwater Plantation. Horses ran loose across the yard, their reins trailing like broken promises. Moses had cut their tethers earlier, firing a pistol into the air to send them into panic. Some had crashed through fences, others vanished into the night. Without their mounts, many hunters were trapped on foot. Servants ran screaming between buildings. Lanterns fell and shattered. Shadows leaped across the walls like ghosts. Colonel Whitmore stood on his raised platform, his white coat now stained with sweat and whiskey. He shouted orders no one obeyed. "They're just slaves," he roared. "Form up! Shoot them down!" But his voice no longer carried authority, only desperation. Abel stepped forward through drifting smoke. For a moment, the two men looked directly at each other. Master and slave, predator and prey. Whitmore reached for his pistol. Moses fired first. The shot struck the colonel in the chest, throwing him backward off the platform. He hit the ground with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire plantation. Something invisible shattered in that instant. Years of fear, years of silence, years of obedience. The enslaved people who had watched from the shadows now surged forward like a rising tide. Kitchen knives, iron tools, broken boards, anything that could become a weapon. Samuel smashed open the gun cabinet inside the main house and began handing out rifles with shaking hands. Ruth struck an overseer with a heavy candlestick, her face wet with tears she did not even feel. This was no longer a hunt. This was an uprising. Gunshots flared in every direction. Windows shattered. Doors were kicked open. Some white men tried to fight, forming desperate defensive circles. Others fled toward the road, abandoning luggage and gold and pride. None escaped far. The fire started in the cotton storehouse. No one ever knew who lit the first flame. Perhaps it was accident. Perhaps it was destiny. Dry timber caught quickly. Wind carried sparks to nearby buildings. Within minutes, the night sky glowed orange, turning darkness into a hellish dawn. Smoke rolled across the fields. Blackwater Plantation, symbol of power and cruelty, began to burn. Abel stood in the yard watching flames climb toward the stars. Around him, men and women who had lived their lives in chains now moved with fierce purpose, gathering food, tools, weapons. Freedom had come not as a gift, but as fire. By midnight, the world they had known was gone forever. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, Blackwater Plantation was no longer a place. It was a memory, burning. Smoke drifted low across the ruined fields like a mourning veil. Charred beams jutted upward from the ashes of the great house, pointing accusingly toward the brightening sky. The smell of wet earth had been replaced by the bitter scent of fire and gunpowder. Where laughter and music had filled the night just hours before, there was now only silence and freedom. The survivors gathered near the edge of the yard, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. Some clutched rifles. Others carried sacks of food, blankets, tools, anything that might help them survive the long journey ahead. No one spoke loudly. Victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like disbelief. For generations, people like them had been told, they were property, told they were weak, told they were incapable of shaping their own fate. Yet the smoking ruins behind them proved otherwise. Abel stood apart from the others for a moment, staring back at what remained of the plantation. Flames still flickered in broken windows. The raised platform where Colonel Whitmore had once delivered his proud speeches lay collapsed and blackened. He felt no joy, only a quiet, heavy certainty. The past had ended here. The future would be uncertain, dangerous, unforgiving. But it would be theirs. Samuel approached him carrying one of the leather bags they had found in the colonel's study. Inside lay stacks of banknotes and heavy gold coins, the betting pool that had drawn so many hunters to their deaths. "Enough money here to buy land," Samuel said softly. "Enough to start new lives." Abel looked down at the bag. Then he shook his head. "This money was earned by blood," he said. "We leave it to burn." One by one the others nodded. They threw the bags into the dying flames. Freedom, they understood now, could not be bought. It had to be taken. Before sunrise, they divided into smaller groups as planned. Some would travel north first to confuse pursuers before turning west toward the Mexican border. Others would follow hidden trails through forests and river valleys known only to Moses and a few trusted guides. They freed every remaining animal except the strongest horses, which they would ride in shifts. Time was precious. Slave patrols and bounty hunters would soon be searching every road. As they left, no one looked back again. Behind them, Blackwater plantations smoldered like a warning carved into the earth. Within days, the story began to spread, at first in whispers among enslaved people working distant fields. A cook overheard a traveler speaking of a massacre in East Texas. A wagon driver carried rumors to Louisiana. A preacher mentioned it cautiously during a sermon in Alabama. A plantation burned. Hunters killed. Slaves escaped. Some said it was impossible. Others said it was divine justice. Still others insisted it was only exaggerated gossip meant to frighten children. But the fear among slave owners was real. They began locking gun cabinets at night. They increased patrols. They watched their enslaved workers with new suspicion, wondering who might be planning something similar. For the first time, the powerful felt uncertainty. For the first time, the enslaved felt hope. 7 long weeks after leaving Blackwater, Abel and the others crossed into Mexico. The journey had cost them dearly. Hunger, sickness, and pursuit had taken their toll. A few were captured. A few vanished into the wilderness and were never seen again. But most survived. They reached small settlements where freedom did not need to be hidden, where a man could walk without lowering his eyes, where no one measured his worth in dollars. Abel built a quiet life there. He worked the land. He learned new languages. He listened for news from the north, rumors of war, talk of abolition, the slow shifting of a nation's conscience. Sometimes in the stillness before dawn, he would remember the swamp. He would remember the faces of those who had not survived. He would remember the night when fear changed sides. Years later, after slavery had finally ended, some of the survivors returned to search for lost family members. Some found them. Many did not. The wounds of separation could never be fully healed. Blackwater Plantation itself was eventually claimed by the state and auctioned to new owners. But no one wanted it. Local people spoke of strange sounds drifting from the swamp on moonless nights, distant gunshots, dogs howling. voices calling through the trees. They said the ground was cursed. They said the dead still walked there. Whether those stories were true or not did not matter, because the legend had already taken root. Across the South, in cabins and churches and hidden gatherings, enslaved people told the story of Abel and the night the hunters became the hunted. It became more than history. It became a warning and a promise. Oppression could be resisted. Power could be challenged. Freedom was not given by kindness. Freedom was taken by courage. And somewhere in the swamps of Texas, the night still remembers. The story of Blackwater is not just a tale of violence or revenge. It is a reminder of something deeper, something that echoes across generations. For years, the men and women of that plantation were told they were powerless, told they were meant to endure suffering in silence, told that survival meant obedience and that hope itself was dangerous. Yet on one dark night in 1856, a small group chose to believe in something different. They believed that even in the harshest chains, the human spirit could still resist. Their victory was not perfect. It was not clean. It came with loss, fear, and uncertainty. Some never reached freedom. Some carried the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. But they proved that history is not only written by the powerful. It is also shaped by those who dare to stand when standing seems impossible. The burning of Blackwater Plantation became more than an uprising. It became a legend, passed quietly from voice to voice. A story meant to give courage to those who felt forgotten. Long after the smoke faded and the swamp reclaimed its silence, the memory of that night continued to inspire others to dream of a different future. And perhaps that is the true power of stories like this. They remind us that freedom is rarely given willingly. It is often claimed through sacrifice, unity, and unbreakable resolve. If you found this story powerful, if you enjoy deep historical stories that reveal the hidden struggles of the past, then I warmly invite you to follow this channel so you never miss the upcoming stories. There are many more untold voices, many more forgotten nights, and many more legends waiting to be remembered.